Okay, so as I stated, tonight's webinar is on workout fueling, the how and why it is so important to properly fuel your workouts. Fueling is a very personal thing, so here are some items to consider when putting together your fueling program and what you should be doing during your particular workout. So the first thing to consider is your rate of sodium loss, and that many times is tied, and most of the time is tied to the rate of fluid loss. So one thing I'll go over during this presentation is how to determine whether or not you are having enough fluid during your particular workouts, and then closely linked to that is the sodium loss. There are sort of average contents of sodium within fluid loss that we could use as benchmarks to then back calculate what our sodium losses may be, which then helps us improperly replace those during our workouts. Next thing would be carbohydrate needs during workouts, which is usually based on body weight and gender as well. Last thing to consider typically for most workouts is whether or not you want to include caffeine, when it's appropriate to include caffeine, and how to actually go about that and what the quantity should be. Some common errors when we start talking about fueling. Either no plan or random plan or a bad plan. We sort of see the gamut of those from athletes that come to us and need help with their fueling. For the folks that have no plan at all, they're really doing themselves a disservice as they're not practicing what they're going to need to be doing on race day, which typically ends up also limiting their workouts. The random plans are also quite common. So these are typically the athletes that have been at it for quite a while but have never paid any particular attention to what their fueling should look like. So in these cases, you have athletes that are going out, eating Snickers bars halfway through their long ride, stopping at gas stations, just sort of hodgepodge, not really planned, and just sort of shooting from the hip, if you will. And the last type of athlete you see are the folks with just a very bad plan. So these folks have actually thought it through, but just haven't thought it through properly, so they're just not choosing the right items out there. Next common error would be minimal practice during training. So, some people may have actually a very, very good race fueling plan that they've used in the past and has worked well for them, but they just don't practice it enough in training. And then when they finally do get to their big race, even though it is a sound fueling protocol for race day in terms of carbohydrate, sodium, and fluid content, they just haven't practiced it enough to actually make it something that they could handle on race day. The next most common error that I see in particular is the single carbohydrate source. So these are products that have usually maltodextrin as the primary carbohydrate and sugar source, and this causing trouble in their fueling. And typically you could get away with a single carbohydrate source for shorter workouts in the 1 to 2 hour range. As soon as you go beyond about 3 to 4 hours, it starts to get dicey. Not only during the workouts, but then, if you're doing that during workouts, you're probably trying to do that on race day, and that's where we see it be a major issue, particularly in Ironman racing on the run leg of the race, where they're out there already for sometimes 8 to 11 hours, we'll call it, before they've even gotten to the run. They end up in the porta potty most of the time when they're dealing with a single carbohydrate source. Throughout the whole day. It just starts to get very difficult on the gut if you're not mixing it up to some degree, just with glycemic index from the sugars that you're using. Next one is too little fluid. This one is probably around 80 to 90% of the cases would be my estimate. Most people just don't drink enough when they're out there training. And again, a lot of people have realized on race day they should be drinking a particular amount that may be the correct amount. But it's not an amount they practice in training enough, okay? So that leaves them dehydrated during the workouts, dehydrated going into subsequent workouts, which has a real performance impact that many people don't realize. So I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Next one would be too little sodium. So for many people that have sort of above average fluid loss rates from their sweating, it typically ties to, as I stated on the previous slide, typically ties to sodium. So if they're losing more fluid than they think they are during the workout, they're typically also losing too much sodium. This also applies to people that have a greater sodium content within their sweat. So these folks end up being very light on sodium, either from the large fluid losses that they have or the fact that they have a higher sodium content per ounce of sweat. And even for the average folks, you see a lot of people not even getting enough sodium in for their particular situation. And most people don't realize it until race day, so they're out there training on a daily basis in a weather situation and intensity situation that is much less severe than race day. So there's no reason for them to think that they're not doing the right thing because everything's going fine, they're not cramping, and this must be the right thing to do. Then they end up out there on race day and it's 10 degrees warmer, the intensity is a little bit higher, the duration is a little bit longer. And they start to run into deficits at that point, and of course it's a little bit too late. So most people, unless they're using particular products as a default, are typically light on sodium. The next one would be too much caffeine and or mistimed caffeine. This one is very, very common, particularly the age group triathlete who's trying to cram a lot of volume, preparing for a longer distance event. They end up having shortcomings on their sleep. And, you know, the typical A-type triathlete does not want to miss a workout. So even though they're missing the quantity of sleep that they should be having, they're still getting in the workouts. And one way they facilitate the ability to have those workouts get done is to use caffeine. So that's very common that we see too much caffeine and also that it's mistimed, meaning they're, for the long workouts, let's say having a cup of coffee, a shot of espresso, an hour to 2 hours before a 5 to 6 hour day. It's just too soon, and the caffeine ends up wearing off at a point during the workout where it's not beneficial to you. So I'll talk about pretty much all of these in quite a bit of detail as we go forward here through the slides. Okay, so why is proper fueling so important? The number one in my mind is to train the gut for race day. So actually training your gut to be able to handle the quantity of carbohydrate, sodium, and fluid that you'll actually require and need to race well on race day. A lot of people don't realize that just because you require a particular amount of fluid and or sodium and or carbohydrate, it doesn't mean you have a gut to be able to handle what your body requires from a physiological standpoint. This is particularly sensitive for the folks that are very high sweat rate sweaters and high sodium content people because they require such a quantity of fluid and sodium that their gut isn't quite able to handle the amount that their body requires. So they really, really have to practice that, and that's why it becomes so important to practice that in training. The number two most important in my mind is to improve the workout quality and recovery. We never want to have a nutritionally limited anything. That's the bottom line. We make too many sacrifices on a daily basis, spending time away from our families, out there training to actually get to race day and have it be nutritionally limited. And the same goes for any of our training days. If we're out there and we've gotten to the track and we want to have a nice key day out there, you know, maybe we've been excited for it for the whole day before we get to the track. Last thing we want is to have it be limited by our nutrition and not our fitness, because that's really what we're all trying to work on here is to improve fitness, okay? So this is something we have 100% control over. There's no reason to shortcome ourselves in this area. So we need to make sure that we're wiping nutrition limiters off the table. This is sort of a subset to that particular bullet is including transition runs. So what I'm trying to say here is although, let's say I go out for a 3 to 5 or 6 hour ride and I want to improve the quality of that workout and not have it be nutritionally limited, how I fuel that workout is obviously going to impact my ability to perform well and be fitness limited on any transition runs that I may do. So super important to fuel the first workout properly such that the second one goes well as well. The next one is to protect muscle tissue from something called neoglucogenesis. So this is the body's process of breaking down muscle protein to create blood sugar. So this is sort of a last resort in your body. It's the last thing that your body wants to do. But if you continue to drive yourself to a point where liver glycogen and muscle glycogen has been totally depleted, we will actually start to break down muscle tissue to create blood glucose. So that's called neoglucogenesis. And the byproduct of that is actually ammonia. So some of you may have smelled ammonia after difficult workouts or workouts that were improperly fueled. That's actually muscle tissue being broken down. So that's not something we want as an athlete typically. We usually work hard to keep muscle tissue and to gain strength. So the last thing we want to do is break it down. And the next bullet, the fourth one here, is very closely related and tied to number 3, which is to keep an anabolic atmosphere the best we can. What we do as athletes, whether we're training 6 hours a week or 30 hours a week, it tends to be a very catabolic routine, or creates a very catabolic atmosphere within the body with cortisol levels up and other catabolic or stress hormone responses. So anything we could do to try to keep a nice anabolic atmosphere will only benefit us, improve recovery, improve immunity. So, this is very closely tied to how we fuel our workouts. When you don't fuel properly, you put your body in a very stressful state where it's forced to break down muscle tissue and start to create this catabolic environment, which as an athlete is not something we want to create. It's difficult enough to try to recover and stay sort of with that anabolic atmosphere from workout to workout under a high training load. Okay, so here's a little figure that I put together that sort of tries to explain this in a graphical sense. So if I take a look at this slide, we start with some preset amount of muscle glycogen. Then during a workout, we have a drastic drop-off in what we have left for storage. And I'm just going to run through athlete A first here, which is the red one. And there's actually two red ones. I'll explain the difference in a minute. But during this first workout, we deplete muscle glycogen to some degree, okay? And the reason why the red one goes below the green one is that the red one was a fella who didn't fuel his workouts as well as the other guy. So he actually dug into his muscle glycogen a little bit deeper. So his point went a little bit lower. Now, during some post-workout recovery period prior to the next workout, he recovers to some degree, and in this case, we're saying that he recovers at the same rate and same amount as the green line, which would be athlete B. So you can see going into the next workout, he's starting with an already depleted muscle glycogen state. So you can see very quickly how we run into this cumulative process where we're continually depleting muscle glycogen and not having proper recovery, and this leads to poor and poorer workout quality as we go forward. So the two red lines are one person who doesn't fuel the workouts properly but recovers very well, and the other one is somebody who fuels the workouts very well but just doesn't post-workout recover well. So I'm going to talk about how to address all those particular potential pitfalls, which would be during the pre-workout, during the workout, and post-workout. The green lines that I have on here, which is athlete B, is somebody who does everything perfect. They fuel very well. They do a very good job with post-workout nutrition. And over time, and it's not going to happen over 3 workouts, but more over a longer period, one of the physiological responses that we get from the training stimulus or training stress that we put on our systems is the ability to actually store more muscle glycogen. So that is one of the many adaptations we look for as a potential benefit as an athlete. So you can see how that slope actually goes up as we're increasing that potential to store muscle glycogen and liver glycogen. The last leg of the green line is just shown to just conceptually give you the sense of what the carbohydrate load does. So the whole purpose of the carbohydrate load is to sort of super compensate beyond what our normal full muscle glycogen state would be. So that would be the ideal scenario where that person goes into race day with more muscle glycogen than he had maybe 5 or 6 months earlier when he was in an untrained state. And then our athlete at the bottom, our friend at the bottom, has really just sort of dug himself into a hole by not properly fueling the workouts and or not properly post-workout recovering with a proper recovery drink and recovery food. So I hope that's helpful just in terms of a visual sense to see the difference and why we're concentrating on race fueling with such detail, or workout fueling, I should say, in this case. Okay, so pre-workout fueling, and now I'm going to talk about 3 sort of distinct windows, and for each one of those I'm going to go through the carbohydrate requirements, the fluid requirements, and or caffeine if it's applicable to that particular window. So it's the pre-workout, the during workout period, and the post-workout period. So the pre-workout fueling window that I like to look at is about within 1 hour prior to the workout. So any food prior to this should be kept at least 2 hours out from the workout start. So the last sort of real, sort of bigger meal, if you have lunch, like a salad, that sort of thing, should be at least 2 hours prior to the workout, particularly if it's a run workout, because those tend to be the most difficult in terms of digestion and the ability to handle things on the gut. So starting with this pre-workout window, which would be within 1 hour prior to the workout, from a carbohydrate perspective, we're looking for about 15 to 50 grams. And I know that's a pretty big range, but it depends on a lot of things. It depends on your body size, depends on how draining or intense we expect the workout to be. It also depends on what and when you had that last real meal. So just to run through a few examples here, if I had a full lunch an hour and a half before the workout, it's only going to be a 30-minute recovery run, it would just be maybe a 15-gram carbohydrate type snack, just like a gel or something like that. Conversely, if it was before the first workout of the day, meaning I woke up and this is basically going to be my breakfast because then I'm heading out on a long ride, in that particular scenario, I would probably even exceed the 50 grams of carbohydrate number. So that's why it should really be scaled, and you could just do it by feel. Just say to yourself, okay, how do I feel now? Am I hungry? Am I not? If you're feeling slightly hungry and you know it's going to be a draining workout, move towards the upper end of this range. If conversely, you know it's going to be a very, very short workout, easy workout, and you ate fairly recently, you can make it a very small snack. But in most cases, you should have something. So in terms of content for that carbohydrate source that you have or pre-workout fuel during that 1 hour before, we want it to be very, very low fiber and very low fat. So oatmeal and peanut butter are really not good choices, even though these are quite common choices. And this explains why. So the fiber tends to irritate the gut. The best way to think of this is like a Brillo pad. A Brillo pad is not something you'd want to put through your digestive system. Tends to irritate the stomach lining and intestinal lining. So definitely want to try to keep the fiber pretty low, in most cases below about 5 grams. The next one is fat, and fat just tends to slow digestion, and that's one of the reasons why when we look at the core diet on a day-to-day basis in between workouts, we actually promote the use of fat with almost every meal, and just for this reason, because it slows digestion and therefore slows the blood sugar or dilutes the blood sugar response from any food or carbohydrate you eat. So that's not something we want during a workout. We want things that go through very easily and digest very easily and don't cause any irritation, or minimal irritation, I should say. So some example choices here would be fat-free Fig Newtons. Bread is a good choice. Not necessarily any hearty whole wheat bread either, just due to the fiber content. Power bars are great, power gels, and in particular, I really like Nature's Valley bars. They're very inexpensive. I think you could get them for about 30 cents a piece if you buy the bigger boxes. They're very short ingredient lists, and they have all the right things. And banana is also a good choice, fairly low in fiber, high in potassium, high in carbohydrate, pretty much void of fat altogether, most of these products. So that's the way to approach that pre-workout window, which is within 1 hour prior to the workout from a carbohydrate standpoint. From a fluid standpoint, in general, on a day-to-day basis, again, from the core diet perspective, we're looking to have about half your body weight in ounces. So if you're a 180-pound athlete, we look to have around 90 ounces of fluid per day in addition to what's lost from our workout. So all this says is have about 16 ounces of that requirement about 20 minutes before the workout, just so we make sure we're going into the workout sort of fully fluid loaded, okay? So the sub-bullet here is, a sport drink like Power Bar Perform or Power Bar Endurance or Gatorade Endurance has the potential to satisfy sort of both of those requirements. So a lot of times it's not a bad idea to just have a full bottle of sport drink, something like Power Bar Perform or Gatorade Endurance prior to your workout to fulfill both the carbohydrate and fluid requirements, okay? In terms of caffeine, in general, and I'll just say this up front because I do talk about caffeine quite a bit throughout the presentation, QT2 on the core diet isn't saying you definitely should or have to have caffeine. I just have it in here as sort of for the folks that do like to use caffeine. It's a very personal preference. These are the sort of guidelines that we typically go by. If you do like to use caffeine, here's the best way to use it. Okay, so caffeine during this pre-workout window, typically none unless it's going to be a very intense key workout where you're really looking at performance metrics and you really want to see yourself do well in. And these are workouts that are typically less than 3 hours long. The reason why I say that is if the workout's longer than 3 hours, you probably shouldn't be having any caffeine during this pre-workout window. You're better off having it during the workout. Just because you start to run out of time with the half-life of the caffeine. Half-life of caffeine is around 6 hours, so if you were to have it an hour prior to the workout, it was a 4 or 5 hour workout, you start risking the possibility that the caffeine is sort of worn off before the end of the workout, and that ends up being the exact time where you want the highest caffeine if you're going to use caffeine, or highest caffeine content in the blood. So I'll talk about that in more detail on subsequent slides. Okay, during workout fueling. Now we're going to run right back through those same buckets. So starting with carbohydrate, I know these slides get a little bit busy, but I wanted to include some detail for reference later on if you end up coming back to the presentation. So in general, on the bike, we like to see a quantity of around 2/3 of your lean body weight. So that's the key here. It needs to be corrected for your approximate body fat percentage. And you could just estimate. It doesn't have to be exact, but at least it gets you in the ballpark. So my example here is for a 160-pound athlete who's 10% body fat. We take, and actually that's a typo, it's not 260, it should be 160 times 0.9, which is 1 minus the 10% body fat times the 2/3, and we get 96 grams per hour. And I would take this as an absolute minimum. So this athlete should be getting 96 grams per hour of carbohydrate as an absolute minimum from both and either the sport drink, power bars, power gels, or any other carbohydrates that they may be having. Okay, so that's the recommendation on the bike. For swimming and running, it's about half of that calculated for the bike. So for this athlete, again, we're talking around 48 grams of carbohydrate per hour during swimming and running. In general, we want this during the workouts for the same reasons I stated on the previous slide, to be very, very low fiber, very low fat, and fairly low in protein. And here I put some specific metrics around that. You know, in terms of low fiber, we want to see less than 3 grams per hour. For fat, it's less than 5 grams an hour, and for protein, it's less than 8 grams an hour. Okay, and again, those items tend not really to have a purpose in the length of race that we're doing. Once you get over around 16 hours of racing, it starts to become a little bit more relevant to add fat and add a more significant amount of protein to the race fueling protocol. But for most training sessions, we definitely want to stay void of that stuff. Really concentrate on the carbohydrate, the fluid, and sodium. So for carbohydrates and fluid and sodium, we really want intake to be as steady as possible. So in terms of the carbohydrates, we want to start this right away during all workouts over 45 minutes. So if you have a 35-minute recovery run, you should probably still have something during the pre-workout window, but it may not be necessary to have something during the workout, and for sure something after, which I'm going to cover on subsequent slides. But in general, anything over 45 minutes should be fueled during the workout. So even if it's a 60-minute sort of aerobic run, you should probably have a gel at 30 minutes through the workout. And then we want to just continue that intake every 45 minutes as sort of as a maximum time gap. For most folks are going to fall between 30 minutes and I'll say 45 minutes. Only the very small people or very large people will be much less frequent or more frequent than those recommendations. But in general, we do want to keep that very steady. The common mistake here is that people will start a long workout, like a 4-hour ride, and maybe not eat anything until 2 hours into the ride because then suddenly they're hungry. And at that point, it's really too late. So we want to get the stomach digesting things as quickly as we can during these long workouts and just get very, very adjusted to handling sort of large quantities of carbohydrate, sodium, and fluid very frequently throughout these workouts because at the end of the day, that's what we require on race day. So some of the best products that we like to use are Power Bar, Power Gel, and the Clip Blocks. Those are all very good. It really mixes up the sugar content, which is something that's important. Like I said earlier, if you get caught with one sugar source for a very long period of time, the stomach tends to start having a difficult time digesting that, and some of the enzymatic pathways that break down these sugars start to get bogged down, and that's why we end up sick or in the porta potty when you start to concentrate too much on one particular sugar source. So that's why I like the Power Bar product so much, because they've done a very good job of mixing up the sugar sources. And I like to spice in a little bit of Clip Blocks just because those are totally different. We went from maltodextrin, dextrose, and fructose in the Power Bar products to brown rice syrup in the Clip Block. So, it really mixes things up well. And just one more quick pointer on that topic in particular. The Clip Blocks tend to be very convenient on the run because you can have one block every 10 minutes or 15 minutes or every 2 miles as an example and really spread out the carbohydrate intake very, very well. They're super convenient in that way. So typically Clip Blocks are best saved for the run and the Power Bar products is best on the bike, but that's very personal in my opinion. So that's just sort of personal preference. And in general, the Power Bar products are just carbohydrates and just sodium as the primary components. You'll see a lot of products out there these days that have a mix of other things like antioxidants, vitamin C, vitamin E, too much protein, so on and so forth. And these are items that won't necessarily make you go any faster on race day, and therefore they're not items we really want to practice with during training. It's fine to include plenty of antioxidants, protein, and those other items during your daily diet, outside of workouts, during the post-workout recovery drink. But during workouts, it only has the potential to irritate the gut and cause problems for you. So that's why we like to stay away from those. So continuing our during workout fueling discussion, now I talk about fluid. So this is very dependent on sweat rates and sort of sweat quantity losses in terms of fluid. So here I try to include, without getting very specific, I try to include some qualitative recommendations that will work for most people, and a good way for you to track it yourself without getting maybe a detailed race fueling test or sweat test. So in general, drink enough to pee every 2 to 2.5 hours on the bike, and at least every hour on the run. So those are absolute minimums, but really at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is not go beyond a 2% dehydration-related weight loss during any particular workout. So if I look at 2% of your body weight here at a 160-pound athlete as my example again, 2% of 160 pounds is losing no more than 3 pounds during any workout. So you'd never want to walk out the door at 160 pounds and come back at 157. It just means you didn't drink enough for your particular physiology and the conditions of that day. So those first two guidelines will get you very, very close to actually what you require. And if you routinely check those weights, and as long as you're not dehydrating more than 2%, you've probably hit the fluid requirements pretty well. So you can sort of iterate and run through that yourself fairly quickly and have a good understanding of what you require for various conditions, okay? The reason why I use 2% is beyond 2% is where studies have shown that we actually have a drop-off in performance. And I can't even tell you how many athletes go into workouts already 2%. So here's that athlete again, really trying to work on their fitness, making all the sacrifices to do that. And just because they're not drinking enough fluid throughout the day while they're at work, they're having their workouts be limited. And even though they're out doing 2-hour runs and 6-hour rides, it's limited by something as simple as taking enough fluid during the day. So common mistake, easy to control. The best thing I can say is just fix it. Okay, so next bullet I have here is a sport drink like Power Bar Performance, and I mentioned this earlier, it does a great job to satisfy both of these requirements, which is the carbohydrate and fluid needs. We never like to use water during workouts or racing. There's really no reason to do it. It tends to put a blank in the system. That's the best way for me to describe it. It allows blood sugar to drop. There's no sodium content, so it messes up the osmolality in the gut. Therefore, starts to impact the way we absorb fluid, absorb carbohydrates. So we really want to stay away from water. Instead, always using these sport drinks that have plenty of sodium and plenty of carbohydrates. So the Power Bar Perform, Power Bar Endurance, or Gatorade Endurance are great choices. So in terms of fluid, what this all boils down to is that most folks will require somewhere between 20 and 60 ounces an hour, depending on the conditions. And sure, there's people higher than that, but there's very few people who are lower than 20 ounces. And if each person on the phone and on the call right now thinks back to workouts they've done, I could guarantee that all of you have had workouts where you've drank less than 20. So make sure you're, at least doing that as an absolute minimum, and then work through some of the concepts. I put it on the first bullet here to cross-check what your actual sweat rate is. Okay, so next, talking about caffeine for during workouts. We like to use it as a tool, and we don't like to overuse it. As I mentioned earlier on the common mistakes slide, many people do overuse it. So sort of in line with that, as we go into our workouts, we really only want to use it if it's going to be a key intensity or key long workout. We certainly don't want to be out there using it on recovery rides and recovery runs or recovery swims. If you see yourself doing that most of the time, it's probably because you're not sleeping enough and you're an A-type athlete like many are, and you just want to get in your workouts come heck or high water. So you end up using caffeine as a crutch to help drag yourself through those workouts. And that's not a scenario that any athlete should be in. So when you see yourself starting to do that, you need to step back and say, okay, big picture, what's the issue here? I'm not resting enough. Maybe I should cut out some workouts and get a little bit more rest. So really save the caffeine for these key intensity or key long workouts where we could use it as a tool and actually help fire us through those workouts and set new personal bests, okay? So when you start to overuse it, either during the day or during too many workouts, your body starts to deregulate, and the caffeine just doesn't have the same impact on your nervous system and just doesn't stimulate you as well. Therefore, when you do go to use it during a key intensity session, it won't have the impact we look for, and or if you go to use it on race day, it won't have the impact that we look for, okay? Next bullet in terms of caffeine is we should always build caffeine throughout the workouts, and this is particularly important as we get into the longer workouts. So as soon as we get over 4 hours, definitely, and my previous slides addressed what to do prior to workout. This is more during workout, but for the workouts that are over 4 hours, they should start with no caffeine. So potentially the first hour or 2 hours, no caffeine, and then slowly start to build into the caffeine. And what that does is it allows us to use the caffeine as a tool to keep our core system, meaning our heart rate and cardiac system, stimulated late into these long workouts where our peripheral systems start to become very, very fatigued. That's always the challenge once you get over 4 hours in terms of a workout length. If we get to 5 or 6 or 7 hours even, particularly if it's at the end of a very difficult training week, we've already built in a lot of accumulated fatigue. The issue isn't keeping heart rate down. The issue is being able to keep it up and actually stay stimulated. So as that peripheral system becomes fatigued late in these workouts, it becomes more and more important to use caffeine as a tool to help keep that core system stimulated and keep pressure on the peripheral system. So some good sources of caffeine are the caffeinated gels and the caffeinated clip blocks are great choices. They typically come pretty much in 2 strengths. Pretty much all the brands come in 2 strengths, and it's really 25 milligrams per about 25 grams of carbohydrate is what everyone calls sort of their single cap, and what everyone calls their double cap is around 50 milligrams of caffeine per 25 grams of carbohydrate. So both gels, the double cap gels fall into that category, and the black cherry clip blocks fall into that category, the higher caffeine category. Okay, so in terms of total quantities, they should be somewhere, if you decide to use caffeine again, it should be in the 50 to 100 milligrams an hour, depending on your body size and your tolerance and ability to handle caffeine. But in terms of sort of a total upper bound limit for a particular day, 200 milligrams is about as far as you want to go for an upper bound intake per day, or just sort of on a regular basis, and definitely 300 milligrams as an absolute maximum. And that's just from a health point of view. If you read some of the literature, there's a pretty good consensus that if you stay below 200 milligrams of caffeine, there shouldn't be any health impacts to you. So certainly 300 milligrams is an absolute maximum during the longest days, 6 to 7 plus hour days. No more than maybe once a week. That would be my absolute maximum recommendation. And honestly, I see athletes go well beyond both of these recommendations all the time. But it typically results in either an irritated gut or that caffeine deregulation where down the road you're going to end up using it as a crutch during a workout that you shouldn't be, and it just starts to lose its purpose and get very muddled. So these are some good recommendations. Lastly, during the workouts here, talking about sodium. So it's very dependent on the sweat rates and the sweat losses and sodium content in sweat. So I tried to define some ranges here to get people in the ballpark. Typically, folks have between 400 and 150 milligrams, 1,500 milligrams of sodium per 16 ounces of sweat loss. So if in those previous slides you've determined that you're losing 30 ounces of sweat an hour or 30 ounces of fluid an hour, you would divide 30 by 16 and then multiply by somewhere in that range. And how you decide where you fall in that range is dependent on what you've observed in yourself. Have you had cramping on race day? Are you covered in white residue after races? And you can get a very good sense of maybe where you fall in that range, and then multiply that sodium content per 16 ounces of sweat times your sweat losses, and be able to calculate a total sodium loss per hour. So once you boil all that down, most folks fall somewhere, based on their sweat rates or the average sweat rate and average sodium content. Almost, I would say about 90% of the people fall between the 400 and 700 milligram range per hour, okay, in terms of sodium losses. So the Power Bar products have done a very good job at creating products that sort of dump you right into that range. If you just use their products to meet your carbohydrate needs that are calculated on the previous pages, or previous slides, you'll actually fall right within this range, and for 90% of folks, that's probably totally fine in terms of sodium content. It's only when you have very significant sweat rates and or sodium contents that you fall outside of this range on a total basis. So very similar to carbohydrates, we want to keep the sodium intake very steady. Again, that's why water is not a good idea. Continuing with the sport drinks, it allows us to get that nice steady carbohydrate and sodium intake throughout the day, okay? So the Power Bar products, as I just discussed, contain one of the highest concentrations per gram of carbohydrate of sodium, therefore tend to be the best option. It doesn't mean you can't use other products. You'll probably just have to supplement with other sodium sources like thermotabs or lava salts or Succeed as examples to get that sodium back up to where it should be for your case, okay? Okay, so that was the series of slides that I had on during workout fueling. Next, I go out into what I call post-workout refueling. So some key components of what we look for this post-workout period is very high glycemic sugars. The highest known to man is dextrose, so any product with dextrose is a great idea. We want it to be very easily digested. The whole purpose here is to get blood sugar up as quickly as possible to restock muscle glycogen. So high glycemic sugar gets blood sugar up very rapidly, and therefore having something that's very easily digested will also get up blood sugar very quickly. So those are probably the two most important things to have, something that's easily digested and very high glycemic. Next in line would be that it has a very good quality, easily digested protein source, okay? In terms of the quantities of both of those, or relative quantities, we like to see about a 4-to-1 ratio of carbohydrates to protein. We can also go as low as 3-to-1 ratio. So anywhere in that range, I'm usually pretty happy. And then as an extra bonus, if you have a product or if you make your own shake or something like that has some antioxidants in it, that can help to mitigate some of the free radical damage caused from the workout. And just one example here is vitamin C and vitamin E. It could have polyphenols or other antioxidants that help mitigate some of the free radical damage. But in general, as endurance athletes, we're primarily using the aerobic energy system. The aerobic energy system is fat oxidative by default in nature. So when we have all this fat oxidation, we end up with oxidative free radicals that go about the body and do all sorts of damage. So the only availability that we have as an athlete to help mitigate some of that free radical damage is via these antioxidants. So it's not a bad idea to include some of those in the post-workout recovery drink. So the quantity that you have of this post-workout recovery drink is really dependent on how draining or intense the workout was, okay? So here I tried to put some guidelines to get folks in the right ballpark. Our favorite drink to use for post-workout recovery is Endurox. It includes dextrose, very high glycemic sugar. It includes whey protein, very easily digested, good quality protein source. It has it in that 4-to-1 ratio of carbohydrate to protein. Also includes plenty of vitamin C and vitamin E and a few other goodies for post-workout recovery. But in general, there's 26 grams of carbohydrate per scoop of Endurox. So here I present the quantities for gender and weight based on scoops of Endurox. You can easily calculate your way away from scoops of Endurox if you want to use something else just by multiplying the number of scoops that I recommend times the 26 grams of carbohydrate, and that'll give you the total carbohydrate that you require. But like I say, in general, we're scaling the amount of recovery drink we have based on how draining or intense a workout is. You know, for men, 150 pounds or over, the maximum you'll probably go is 4 scoops of Endurox, and that would only be after your toughest workout, 6 hours plus. You know, for women that are over 130 pounds, probably go up to about 3 scoops maximum for the toughest workouts, you know, again, around, 5 or 6 hour type workouts plus, okay? For workouts less than 60 minutes, in general, you probably don't require something like Endurox for a recovery drink unless you're doing very intense intervals very quickly through that whole 60-minute period. For the most part, you can probably get away with just some small carbohydrate snack that at least meets the intent of our recovery items that we discussed, meaning it's easily digested and fairly high glycemic. A good one here would be raisins as an example, or cranberry juice. You know, if it's a 35 or 40-minute recovery run, not a bad idea. You could just go with a handful of raisins and a glass of water, something like that. So then we have the carbohydrates, and we're able to get the fluid in there, okay? Another option and that I put in the sub-bullet at the bottom was, chocolate milk, fat-free chocolate milk isn't bad as a recovery drink if you're in a bind or traveling and you don't have access to a more high-quality recovery drink. At least it typically, most of the brands meet that 4-to-1 ratio of carbohydrate to protein. Fairly high glycemic carbohydrate because they're usually sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. The only downside is the protein quality isn't that good, and it's not very quickly digested, so it tends to slow down the blood sugar response. But it's not bad in a bind. Okay, so that was everything that I put together for the webinar tonight on fueling during your workout. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and end the presentation. I'm going to open up the audio, and we'll go through a Q&A. I haven't seen anything come up on the chat in terms of questions, so we'll just have an open discussion as I open up the audio here. Okay, everybody is now opened up, so do we have any questions? No questions. Well, that was easy then. So I appreciate everybody joining me on the webinar. I appreciate your patience. If anybody has any suggestions for future webinars, feel free to just contact our services address or really any of us, any of our coaches or me directly. And we'll be happy to incorporate them. We're going to try to run a core diet webinar at least once a month, along with our QT2 webinars, which will run once a month on training topics. So feel free to suggest what you like, and we'll try to work in the best we can. Thanks for attending, everyone.
Thanks. Jesse.